The lecture begins. The hall of the Galactic University was vast, its ceiling high enough to hold entire starships and its walls lined with banners from 100 different civilizations. Rows upon rows of alien students sat waiting, their eyes glowing, scales shimmering, antennae twitching, each of them eager to hear the great lecture about one of the most dangerous worlds ever recorded. Earth. The planet was spoken of as a place where storms tore the skies apart, where the ground shook without warning, and where the seas rose to swallow entire coasts. To most species, it was considered unlivable, a nightmare world better left forgotten. That was why this lecture had drawn such a crowd, because nothing fascinated young minds more than danger from a safe distance. At the front stood the professor, an elder being of the Valyrian race, tall and lean with skin like polished bronze. His voice echoed through the hall as he began to speak. He told them that Earth was a place where climate shifted so fast that no species could evolve quickly enough to survive them. He explained that the cold of its winters could freeze blood in minutes, that its summers could cook the ground until it cracked, that storms of water and storms of sand could sweep across continents. His words carried weight, for he had studied hundreds of worlds, yet none as chaotic as this one. The students laughed when he called it a death world, a place unfit for life. They laughed not out of joy but out of disbelief, for to them no creature could endure what he described. They whispered to each other that perhaps Earth was a myth, an exaggeration used to teach them the limits of survival. The professor continued, with pride, saying that if any species were dropped upon its surface without preparation, they would perish within days, perhaps hours. He described the predators that stalked its forests, the insects that carried disease, the plants that poisoned as easily as they nourished. Among the crowd, near the front row, sat one figure who did not laugh. He looked almost unremarkable, small compared to the towering insectoids beside him, plain compared to the shimmering reptilian students to his left. His clothing was simple, his expression calm, but his eyes were fixed on the professor with a steadiness that unsettled those close enough to notice. He took notes with quiet precision, his hand moving swiftly across his pad. When the students around him glanced at what he wrote, they found strange words they did not understand, symbols from a language not common in the galaxy. The professor spoke of the shifting winds of Earth, where one day might bring heat and the next bring snow. He spoke of rivers that overflowed, destroying entire settlements, and of volcanoes that spat fire into the skies. The hall echoed with murmurs and gasps, yet the figure in the front row remained silent, nodding slightly as though he had heard all of this before, as though none of it surprised him. He sat with his back straight, his jaw firm, his presence quiet yet heavy, as if he carried with him something the others could not see. As the lecture went on, some of the younger aliens noticed him. A small creature with bright feathers whispered to his companion that the quiet student looked different. His skin was bare of scales or fur, his eyes sharper, his frame built in a way that suggested both strength and endurance. Rumors began to move through the crowd like a current in water, soft at first but slowly growing. They wondered who he was, why he sat so close to the stage, why he listened so intently when others laughed at the professor's dramatic warnings. The professor's voice grew stronger as he declared that Earth was not just dangerous, but impossible. It was a world that no one could master, a planet that demanded death as its price for every attempt at survival. The hall filled with agreement, nodding heads and clicking mandibles, and yet in the front row the quiet figure finally allowed himself the faintest smile. It was not a smile of amusement but of memory, the kind born from experience that others could only imagine. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes reflecting the light of the hall, and for a moment one could almost sense the weight of storms, of fire, of ice, carried within him. The lecture continued with maps of Earth's continents, diagrams of its weather systems, and stories from explorers who had never returned. Each word painted the planet as more hostile than the last, and each time the professor insisted no creature could thrive there. The audience nodded in agreement, secure in their belief that they were far above such savagery. But in the silence of the front row sat the truth they did not yet know, a truth waiting patiently to be revealed. and with every passing moment, the tension in the room grew as if the planet itself was leaning closer to listen. The alien arrogance. The professor paced slowly across the stage, his long robes sweeping the polished floor as he spoke with certainty, his words carrying the weight of authority. He told the crowd that Earth was not a planet to admire but one to avoid, a cursed sphere where life should never have taken root. He raised his thin arms toward the holographic display above him, and it shifted to show violent storms, towering, waves crashing against coasts, endless deserts stretching into the horizon and mountains splitting open with fire. The alien students gasped and chuckled nervously, convinced that no creature could possibly call such a place home. They repeated to themselves that it was a lesson in extremes, not a story of reality, because no living being could look into the heart of such fury and survive. The younger students loved the drama of it all. They nudged one another and whispered that perhaps the professor exaggerated the storms to frighten them into respecting planetary science. A tall insectoid student clicked his mandibles and said that even his species, known for living in volcanic tunnels, would crumble under the cold blizzards the professor described. A scaled reptilian scoffed and declared that if her kind were dropped on Earth, they would not last even 1 week. The hall filled with voices mocking the very idea that Earth could host intelligent life. To them, the planet was nothing but a warning, etched into the stars, a place better left to legend. The professor smiled at their arrogance, for he encouraged it, letting them believe they had learned something important. He declared that Earth had likely killed off any species unfortunate enough to rise there, that intelligence could not bloom in constant chaos, that every attempt at civilization would have been swept away by storm or famine or plague. His tone carried the confidence of a scholar certain of his own mastery, and the audience applauded, proud of themselves for absorbing the wisdom. They believed themselves clever, enlightened by this knowledge, and yet they understood none of the truth, hidden in plain sight. Near the front row, the quiet figure listened without a word. His hands remained folded, his eyes fixed on the professor with the patience of someone who had endured far worse than lectures. He remembered the heat of summer days when the ground shimmered, when air burned with dust, when thirst felt like fire in the throat. He remembered nights so cold that breath froze into white clouds and every sound cracked in the still air. He thought of storms that split trees like twigs, rivers that rose without mercy, skies that turned black with lightning. These were not stories to him, but memories carved deep into his bones. Yet he sat still, watching and waiting, letting the others laugh and scoff, letting them believe the words of a man who had studied, but never lived. Some of the students noticed his silence and exchanged curious glances. His body bore faint scars along his hands, small marks that spoke of wounds healed long ago. His posture was not that of a meek scholar, but of someone who had stood against weight and endured. One feathered student whispered that the quiet one did not seem amused by the stories. Another suggested that perhaps he came from a harsher world himself. Yet none of them dared to ask, for the human's gaze was sharp, and though he had not spoken, he carried himself with a strength that unsettled them. The professor raised his voice once more and declared that if a being were somehow forced to live on Earth, it would crumble within days. He painted a picture of creatures gasping for air in thin mountain altitudes, of bodies broken by storms, of minds shattered by endless fear of predators lurking in the shadows. He laughed and said that Earth was a world where even the smallest insect could carry death in a single bite. The hall erupted in laughter again, their voices echoing against the high walls, their arrogance filling the air like smoke. They believed they were safe in their judgment, certain that they understood what survival meant. But the quiet figure in the front row did not laugh. Instead, he allowed a slow breath to escape and kept his eyes on the professor, his expression unreadable. He knew the truth of insects that carried fever, of plants that could kill if touched, of storms that tore apart whole cities. He knew of predators that stalked the night with eyes shining and teeth sharp, of seas that swallowed ships whole, of mountains that buried villages in their collapse. The alien spoke of these things as though they were abstract horrors, but for him they were only part of home. The arrogance of the crowd grew with each passing word, and still he waited. The lecture was not yet over, and he would not yet reveal himself. There would come a time when their mocking laughter would die in their throats, when their certainty would shatter, when they would understand that Earth was not just a theory to be studied but a forge that created survivors unlike any in the galaxy. That time was approaching, and as the professor spoke louder and prouder, the human in the front row sat silently, holding within him the storm they could not imagine. Signs of unease. The lecture stretched on, the professor moving from the violent storms to the shifting of Earth's ground, speaking of quakes that could tear apart cities and swallow them whole. He described how mountains rose and fell across the planet's history, how fire and ash could choke skies for years, and how seas rose without mercy. His voice was steady and full of pride, as though he was revealing mysteries of the cosmos to minds too young to grasp them. The audience nodded, some still laughing, some taking notes, all believing they were learning about a world no living intelligence could endure. Yet in the silence of the front row, the human sat still, watching. His face calm, but his eyes carrying a weight none of them could understand. It was during one of these long explanations that the first signs of unease began to ripple through the hall. A young scaled student with bright emerald skin leaned closer to her companion and whispered that the quiet figure was unlike any species she recognized. She pointed out the scars on his hands, the lines across his knuckles, the shape of his shoulders that spoke of work and struggle. Her companion, a feathered alien with sharp golden eyes, tilted his head and admitted he had been watching too. He noted how the quiet one did not flinch when the professor described storms that could flatten forests, how he seemed almost to nod as if he had seen such storms with his own eyes. They looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who he was and why he listened so intently. Whispers began to spread further back, passed from one row to the next, until clusters of students were glancing forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the mysterious figure. Some suggested he might be from a newly contacted world with a harsh climate of its own. Others guessed he might be a military observer, trained to keep his expression still and his mind sharp. A few laughed at the idea that he was anything more than a strange visitor, yet even they could not fully shake the unease that settled in their chests when they noticed his calmness in the face of horrors meant to terrify. The professor was too wrapped in his own words to notice the change in atmosphere. He projected images of deserts stretching endlessly under a sun that burned the ground into cracked wasteland. He spoke of creatures adapted to that land, creatures that killed for a sip of water, creatures that endured heat no machine could survive for long. He declared that no intelligent being could ever master such land, for it was too wild, too merciless. The crowd responded with gasps and murmurs, yet in the front row the human's lips curved into the smallest smile, a smile that did not reach his eyes. To him, the deserts were not death but part of life, memories of long journeys and hard lessons. He could still taste dust on his tongue, could still remember heat that pressed down like a weight, yet he had endured, and so had his people. A young insectoid student raised his antennae high and asked his companion if the quiet one might actually be from Earth itself. The suggestion was met with laughter, sharp and dismissive, but the insectoid did not join in. He pointed out that the professor had said no one could survive Earth, yet here was someone who listened as though he had lived the very storms described. His companion scoffed and said Earth was only a myth, a story used to teach resilience, and that no creature of flesh and blood could survive its rage. Still, the insectoid's gaze lingered on the silent figure, unease growing with every passing minute. The whispers grew bolder, reaching even the higher rows where older students sat. Some leaned forward, their eyes narrowing, their curiosity piqued. They noticed the way the human's hands tightened slightly whenever the professor spoke of suffering, how his jaw set firm when laughter filled the hall. These were not the reactions of someone hearing distant legends. They were the reactions of someone who remembered, someone who carried scars deeper than those on his skin. The realization spread like a shadow across the room, faint at first, but growing, until many in the hall no longer felt as comfortable in their seats as they had when the lecture began. Still the professor spoke, lost in his own rhythm, declaring that Earth was a place where the strongest would break and the weakest would vanish. He insisted no intelligent creature could endure its cruelty long enough to build cities or culture. He ended this section of the lecture with certainty, saying that if any being claimed to come from Earth, it would be nothing more than a dangerous lie. The crowd erupted once more in laughter and applause, their arrogance ringing through the hall, yet in that sound there were threads of unease. Voices quieter than before, laughter thinner, for too many eyes were fixed now on the silent figure in the front row who had still said nothing. The human did not move. He sat straight, his eyes steady, his silence unbroken. But within him was a storm waiting for the right moment, and though the others could not yet name it, they could feel its presence pressing against them. The unease was growing, and soon it would no longer be whispers in the crowd, but something undeniable that even the professor himself would not be able to ignore. The first challenge. The professor raised his long fingers and called for silence, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed himself unshakable. He declared that even if an intelligent being could somehow survive a few days on Earth, it would never survive the shifting seasons. He described how the planet could burn with searing heat and then within months be buried beneath ice. He said, no body could adjust. No mind could withstand such constant change. No society could rise strong enough to last more than a fleeting moment. The words stirred the hall into agreement, nodding heads and muttered affirmations, as if the case was closed and the lesson complete. That was when something happened that none of them expected from the front row. The quiet figure who had endured the entire lecture in silence lifted his hand. The gesture was calm, deliberate, but in the echoing hall, it drew every eye like a spark in darkness. Conversation stopped and laughter froze as alien students turned to look at him. The professor faltered for a breath, surprised that anyone dared interrupt, but he quickly regained his composure and called on the student with a touch of impatience. The hall held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The figure spoke, at last, his voice even and steady, carrying none of the arrogance that filled the room. He asked a simple question. What if someone had lived through all of these things, not as theory, but as memory? The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Then laughter erupted across the room, wild and mocking, students clutching their sides at the absurdity of the thought. A reptilian student shouted that no one could live through such madness. Another jeered that the quiet one must be trying to impress his peers. The professor allowed the laughter to swell before raising his hand for calm. His eyes gleamed with a hint of amusement as he asked the student if he truly believed he could endure the seasons of Earth. The quiet figure did not flinch. He nodded once, his eyes locked on the professor, his posture straight and unyielding. The room roared again with ridicule, unable to accept the calm certainty in his gaze. The professor, eager to put the student in his place, decided to test him. He painted a scenario with words sharp as knives. He spoke of a winter where the cold cut through bone, where breath froze in lungs and villages vanished beneath snowstorms that lasted weeks. He asked how any creature could possibly survive such a nightmare. The quiet one responded without hesitation. He spoke of fire, of shelter, of endurance passed down through generations, of bodies strengthened by struggle and minds sharpened by necessity. He spoke with a detail that unsettled those listening, for his answer was not theory but lived truth. The professor frowned but pressed on, describing a summer where the sun scorched the land until crops withered, rivers shrank, and the air shimmered with unbearable heat. He asked how anyone could endure hunger, thirst, and exhaustion for so long. Again, the quiet one answered without pause. He spoke of rationing, of digging wells, of walking under burning skies with skin blistering yet spirits unbroken. His words held the weight of memory, not imagination, and the whispers in the hall grew louder. The professor's pride flared, and he shifted his challenge to the wild storms of Earth. He described hurricanes tearing apart cities, winds that shattered buildings, floods that swallowed whole coasts. He demanded to know how anyone could outlast such chaos. The quiet one leaned forward slightly, his voice calm as he spoke of preparation, of warning signs in the clouds, of people rebuilding, again and again because surrender was not an option. He spoke of hands blistered from clearing rubble, of families surviving together, of strength forged not by choice but by the will to live. The hall no longer laughed. The whispers had turned into murmurs of disbelief, eyes wide and fixed on the figure in the front row. Some students shivered, though the air was warm, sensing the truth in his words. They began to realize that he was not speaking as one who guessed or imagined, but as one who remembered. The professor, though still cloaked, in pride hesitated for the first time. His sharp tongue could not disguise the crack forming in his confidence. He asked the quiet one directly how he could possibly know these things with such certainty. The figure met his gaze and answered with the calmness of someone who had nothing to prove. He said he knew because he had lived them. The words struck the hall like thunder, echoing in every corner, leaving behind silence heavy enough to smother breath. The professor's mouth tightened. Students shifted uneasily. And for the first time since the lecture began, the arrogance in the room began to falter. The quiet one sat back once more, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady, waiting for the storm he knew was only just beginning, shock and fear. The words hung in the air long after they had been spoken, and though they were simple, they struck the audience with a force no storm could equal. The quiet figure in the front row had said he knew these horrors because he had lived them, and for a moment the great hall of the Galactic University seemed frozen in time. The professor's hand trembled slightly, though he tried to disguise it by adjusting the folds of his robe. The students stared wide-eyed, their mocking laughter gone as though snatched away by an unseen wind. The silence was so complete that even the hum of the translation devices embedded in the walls felt louder than the thoughts racing in their minds. The professor cleared his throat and tried to steady his voice. He declared that it was impossible, that the student was surely speaking in metaphor, that perhaps he came from a harsh colony world and confused it with the chaos of Earth. But his words carried less weight now, and the calm eyes of the human sitting so still in the front row only made them seem hollow. The professor tried again, demanding evidence, demanding explanation, but the figure answered not with data or charts, but with the voice of memory. He began to tell stories, and every word made the hall lean closer despite themselves. He spoke of nights when the sky itself seemed alive with lightning, when thunder shook the ground and rain came down in sheets so heavy it drowned entire fields. He described huddling inside structures barely holding together, listening as winds screamed outside and trees snapped like brittle sticks. His voice was steady, his tone unflinching, and though he did not raise his voice, it filled the hall with a weight none of the students could ignore. He spoke of days when the sun glared so fiercely that the earth cracked open and animals fell where they stood, of walking across burning ground with lips dry and skin scorched, of enduring thirst until every step was a victory. The professor tried to interject, but the stories kept coming. The human spoke of winters where snow buried homes and entire towns vanished beneath white silence. He told of families surviving by firelight, of food stretched across weeks, of frost-biting fingers and toes until they ached with pain yet life endured. He spoke of floods that rose in the night, carrying away all that was built, and of the strength it took to rebuild again and again. Each tale was vivid, each detail painted with the sharpness of someone who had lived it, and the students began to shift in their seats, their eyes darting to each other, their arrogance crumbling. Into unease, fear began to replace disbelief. Some students whispered that he must be lying, but their voices shook. Others leaned forward, drawn in despite their dread, because deep inside they knew these were not lies. No one could invent such memories with such clarity. The reptilian who had mocked earlier sat still now, her golden eyes wide as if she finally understood the gravity of the truth standing before her. The feathered students who had whispered about him earlier kept silent, their feathers pressed flat against their bodies as if bracing against an unseen storm. The professor asked at last who he truly was, but the human only gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. He said that where he came from, survival was not an academic exercise but a daily task, that children were raised not with fear of the world but with the will to endure it. He said that storms, quakes, and droughts were not the end but only another obstacle to overcome. His calm words were heavier than the professor's booming declarations, and they settled over the audience like an unseen weight pressing down on every chest. The students no longer laughed. They looked upon him with something new, a mixture of awe and fear, because for the first time they realized they were not speaking about legends or distant theories, but about a living survivor of the very world they had dismissed as impossible. The professor's face had grown pale and his hands clutched the podium as though to steady himself. The authority he once carried now wavered in the face of the calm certainty of the figure before him. Whispers turned into uneasy silence once more. The truth could no longer be mocked away, and the arrogance of the crowd had been broken. They now stared at the human with questions they were too afraid to ask, their thoughts turning in circles as they tried to understand what it meant. If someone could survive Earth, if humanity could rise on such a world, then everything they thought they knew about danger and resilience was wrong. The human remained seated, his posture unchanged, his eyes steady as ever, waiting for the moment when the illusion of the lecture would collapse completely, and the galaxy's young minds would understand the real lesson they had just begun to learn, the revelation. The hall seemed to pulse with silence as the professor struggled to find his words. The authority that once carried him was gone, replaced by a hollow echo that no longer reached the students the way it had at the start. They were no longer focused on his holograms of storms and shifting continents. Their eyes were fixed on the man in the front row who had sat through ridicule and arrogance without a single outburst, who had spoken calmly while the hall mocked him, and who now carried himself with a presence that was impossible to ignore. The tension grew heavier with each passing breath until the professor finally asked in a voice that trembled, despite his effort to steady it. "Who are you?" The man stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor, a sound that cut through the stillness like a blade. The aliens leaned forward as one, their eyes wide, their breaths held. He was not taller than many of them, nor more imposing in form, yet when he stood, the entire hall seemed to shrink around him. His shoulders were straight, his eyes steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the hall with calm clarity. He said he was a son of Earth. The words sent a shock through the audience, so sharp that several students gasped aloud. A murmur rippled across the room, disbelief colliding with fear. They had spent the entire lecture convinced Earth was a cursed world, a death sentence, a place where no intelligence could rise. Yet before them stood proof that all of that was wrong. The professor staggered back a step, his bronze features paling. He stammered that it could not be true, that Earth was a world of endless violence, of storms that would crush civilizations before they began, of predators that would never allow intelligence to flourish. The man's reply was simple. That was exactly why his people had flourished. He explained that every hardship described was real, every storm and every famine and every predator, but they had not been barriers to life. They had been the forge that shaped humanity. He said survival on Earth was never easy, that his people had suffered losses beyond counting, yet each challenge had carved strength deeper into them, until endurance was not a choice, but a way of life. The crowd was silent, now listening not because they wanted to, but because they could not turn away. The reptilian student who had laughed so loudly earlier now sat with her tail curled tight around her legs, her scales trembling. The insectoid who had wondered if he was from Earth stared with wide, unblinking eyes, antennae stiff as stone. The feathered students pressed closer together, their feathers flat, their breaths shallow. Every instinct told them they were looking at something dangerous, something they had never been prepared to face, and yet they could not stop listening. So, man lifted his hand and showed his palm. Scars lined it, small pale marks across the flesh. He said these were not trophies but reminders. Reminders of fire, of blade, of accident, of all the dangers that came with simply living on Earth. He turned slightly and let the light catch the side of his face, where another faint scar ran just above his brow. He said his people bore such marks not because they sought danger, but because danger was everywhere and still they endured. He looked across the hall, his gaze meeting eyes that darted away in fear, and he told them that humanity was proof that life did not just adapt to chaos, it thrived in it. The professor whispered that such beings would be monsters, creatures of war and destruction, and the man answered with a quiet firmness. He said humans were not monsters but survivors. They were builders who rebuilt after every storm. healers who found cures for sickness born from hostile lands, dreamers who looked at the wild skies of Earth and still imagined reaching for the stars. He said the strength of his people did not come from arrogance but from necessity, and that it was this necessity that had made them something the galaxy had yet to understand. The hall remained frozen, every student caught between fear and awe. They had believed Earth was only a theory, a warning tale to remind them of limits, but here was the living embodiment of that tale standing before them. Some felt pride in their own species dissolve like sand through fingers, replaced with the realization that compared to humans, they were soft, shielded by gentler worlds. Others felt a growing dread, because if humanity could endure what no other species could, then what would happen when such beings spread across the galaxy? The professor sank into silence, unable to answer, unable to reclaim the lecture. The human stood firm, his calm presence holding the room captive. He said Earth had never been a curse. It had been a teacher, harsh and unyielding, and humanity was its lesson. The lecture had ended, though the professor had not dismissed it, and everyone knew the truth could not be contained again. The revelation had been spoken, and now the galaxy's young would carry it in their minds forever. The lesson that echoed across the galaxy. The hall remained in stunned silence long after the human had finished speaking, his presence still lingering in the minds of everyone present like a shadow that refused to fade. The aliens who had come to lecture on the supposed dangers of Earth now found themselves the ones being schooled, their assumptions shattered, their pride trembling under the weight of a single being who had endured what they thought impossible. The professor, once so full of confidence and authority, now sat frozen, his claws clutching the edge of the podium, as if to anchor himself against the revelation that threatened to upend everything he had taught. He had spoken with certainty about the futility of surviving on Earth, about the weakness of humans, yet every word he had uttered had been proven wrong in the span of a few hours. The human's calm voice, unwavering and steady, had undone decades of arrogance in mere minutes, and for the first time, the students saw the cracks in the armor of their instructors. The human stood tall in the front row, observing the reactions. Around him, his eyes scanning the crowd as if weighing their understanding. Some of the students stared in awe, unable to comprehend the resilience, intelligence, and endurance embodied in a species they had been taught to dismiss. Others shrank back, instinctively aware of a power that was not visible in weaponry or size but in the essence of survival itself, a strength forged through centuries of relentless struggle. The professor cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he asked a question he could not fully form because it carried an unspoken admission of defeat. How do you survive such a world and still rise above it? The human's lips curved into the faintest smile, and he answered with quiet certainty. He said survival on Earth demanded more than adaptation. It demanded ingenuity, courage, and a refusal to surrender to circumstances. Every storm, every predator, every disaster had been a lesson in endurance, a test of willpower that honed both body and mind. Humans had learned not only to face danger but to anticipate it, to overcome it, and to turn it into opportunity. He said the strength of his people was not in destruction or fear, but in the relentless drive to live and to thrive, even when the odds were stacked impossibly high. The students listened, some with wide eyes, others with pale scales and twitching antennae, as they began to understand that Earth was not a place to be pitied, but a crucible that forged warriors, thinkers, and dreamers beyond imagination. The professor's voice shook as he asked another question, almost pleading for reassurance, though he feared the answer. Are humans truly capable of spreading this strength beyond their home world? Without a word, the human gestured to the viewports, behind him, where distant stars and swirling nebulae shimmered like embers in the void. He said humanity was already reaching beyond Earth, carrying with them the lessons of endurance, adaptability, and courage. They did not merely survive in the galaxy. They challenged it, reshaping expectations, breaking limitations, and reminding all who underestimated them that the universe was not a place for weakness. He explained that Earth had taught them to confront the impossible and to turn fear into strategy, danger into preparation, and chaos into opportunity. A murmur rose among the students, some struggling to reconcile what they had been taught with the reality before them. The feathered ones adjusted their wings uneasily, the reptilians pressed their scales closer together, and the insectoids flexed their segmented limbs, all feeling the presence of a species that could not be contained by conventional measures. The human continued saying that the lessons of Earth were not secret but universal, waiting for anyone who chose to understand that true strength came not from domination or power, but from the ability to endure, to adapt, and to rise after every fall. He said the galaxy had underestimated humanity for far too long, and that underestimation was a mistake that could never be repeated. As the hall emptied, the students carried with them a sense of awe and unease, their previous arrogance replaced by respect tinged with fear. The professor remained behind, staring at the human, understanding at last that no lecture, no hologram, no theory could encapsulate the reality of survival on Earth. The human's quiet presence, his scars, his calm voice, and his unwavering eyes had spoken more powerfully than any words of caution or warning ever could. Humanity was a force born of necessity, refined by adversity, and destined to reshape the perceptions of the galaxy itself. The human finally turned and left the hall, not with arrogance or threat, but with the simple certainty of someone who had endured the unthinkable and lived to demonstrate it. Behind him, the echoes of his lesson lingered like the first light of a distant star, illuminating the minds of those who had witnessed it. They knew they had seen something extraordinary, something that would forever alter their understanding of life, survival, and strength. They had been taught about Earth, yet they had learned from a human that the lessons of endurance were far greater than any lecture could convey, and that the galaxy would never again underestimate the species born from storms, fire, and relentless determination, humanity's lesson. Carved in memory, the hall was empty now except for the faint hum of energy that lingered in the air as if the universe itself had paused to witness what had occurred. Every alien present felt the weight of revelation. Pressing upon their minds and hearts, the human had not shouted or threatened, but had shown through presence and words the unyielding truth of a species forged in adversity that could endure anything. The students who had come to scoff now left, in quiet contemplation, their minds spinning with images of storm-survived battles overcome and challenges that would have crushed any other species. The professor lingered behind, unable to move his limbs, as he realized that his knowledge had been dwarfed by a reality he had refused to imagine. The human's calm eyes had reflected centuries of struggle and triumph, that no lecture could ever convey. That gaze had told stories of worlds survived, of enemies defeated not through sheer force but through will, intelligence, and courage that no alien had witnessed before. As the students filed out, some looked back with hesitant admiration, others with fear that something they had never encountered was now part of the galaxy's living truth. The human had not raised a weapon or unleashed a fleet. He had done something far more profound. He had redefined what it meant to survive, to thrive, to endure, to rise when the universe seemed to conspire against you. The professor finally spoke, his voice barely audible, asking, "How could one species achieve so much without resorting to the methods we rely upon?" The human turned slightly and simply said that survival was not about domination, but about adaptation and resilience, about learning from every hardship, about never surrendering even when everything seemed lost. That lesson lingered in the hall and spread beyond its walls, carried in whispers across star systems as students returned to their worlds, telling others of the human who had changed everything, who had walked among them and taught them without intention of teaching. That strength came from endurance, courage, and relentless determination. The story of that human would travel farther than any fleet or weapon, carrying the truth that humanity could not be measured by technology or size but by spirit, by the fire that burned within them, by the storms they had faced and conquered. The aliens could no longer see Earth as weak or insignificant. They had witnessed proof that humans were a force that could shape the galaxy and challenge any expectation that had ever been held about them. And as the human departed the hall, leaving behind only echoes of lessons and the quiet weight of awe, the universe seemed to tilt slightly in acknowledgement that a new chapter had begun. That species once underestimated now commanded respect, not through fear, but through undeniable proof of their essence, and the galaxy would remember the day a human had sat quietly in the front row and taught the universe the true meaning of survival. The end.